Hello, everyone. On the 4th of September, President Erdogan of Turkey traveled to Russia in Sochi to meet President Putin. And the things they spoke about, major of them was the Ukraine grain issue. Now, Africa also came up in this discussion of the Russia grain deal and this grain which is supposed to come from Ukraine. Russia, Turkey, the United Nations had agreed that they would transport grain through the Black Sea, and therefore this was termed as the Black Sea deal. And Africa has majorly been mentioned because it has been referred to as the place which needs food, and it needs this food is supposed to come from Ukraine. But what we want to examine exactly, does Africa really need food? And is it true that what has been said consistently, that Africa is the one receiving the grain coming from Ukraine by the United States, Europe, and the United Nations, is true? Is it true that Africa has been receiving that grain? Is it the one which is receiving majority of that grain? And what does Russia say about this issue? What does Turkey itself say about this issue of grain that is coming from Ukraine? And does Ukraine itself produce enough grain to be able to feed Africa with 1.4 billion people, as it has been mentioned consistently? Now, this grain deal from Ukraine was started, as I mentioned, by the three partner groups. And it was to allow the grain that was supposed to come from Ukraine onto the international market. And it was supposed to be excused from the war that is ongoing. So both the fighting groups, both Ukraine and Russia, were supposed to provide an exit route for this grain to come to the international market. And during this conversation or this agreement, which Russia had with Turkey and the United Nations, the United States and its European allies were supposed to remove sanctions from Russia's grain so that Russia's grain also can have access to the international market, so Russia can also sell its grain onto the international market. Now, what happened in the first part of the deal is that Russia allowed Ukraine's grain to come to the international market. And it did not bomb the ships, it did not attack the storage stores, and Ukraine's grain came to the international market. Because remember, as I told you, originally it was mentioned that the grain was majorly coming to feed the poor countries of the global south. And of course, especially when you're talking about the global south, you are talking about Africa and the African continent. That is what they mean. Now, Russia allowed that grain, of course, as we've mentioned. The United States and Europe, they did not reciprocate. They did not fulfill their part of the deal or the agreement. Now, this visit by President Erdogan of Turkey comes as he is trying to revive that deal that was signed, because Russia would come and cancel this deal later on. It would pull out of the deal because of the reasons which I've already mentioned, that its part of the demand was not fulfilled by the United States and Europe, that Russia's grain was not allowed onto the international market. Now, President Erdogan comes to Sochi in Russia trying to resurrect that deal. But President Putin said that the deal that allowed Ukraine to export its grain would not be restored until the West lifts its embargo on Russia, and Russia would be able to access the international market. Now, that meeting also came after 2 months. That is what they are saying. That is what this article is saying. It came after 2 months when Russia quit the UN and Turkey brokered agreement that allowed Ukraine to export its grain and other commodities from 3 of its Black Sea ports during the war with Russia. So now here comes the dilemma. It has been mentioned numerously on numerous occasions that this grain is coming to Africa. Now, this is what is of very much interest to us as Africans, especially. What is of interest to us as Africans is we want to examine, was the grain really coming to Africa? And does Africa really need this grain? As it has been mentioned consistently by the United States has been sending its diplomats on the African continent to Africa, and they have been pushing this narrative that Africa needs the grain. But when we remember, or if we are to remember the call which President Zelensky had with President Museveni, which President Museveni of Uganda came out to say in broad daylight that he had a call with President Zelensky, and President Zelensky of Ukraine was offering grain to Uganda, of course, for the support that Uganda should be able to support Ukraine at the United Nations. Now, President Museveni would mention that Uganda does not need grain because Uganda is self-sufficient when it comes to food. And of course, President Zelensky was disappointed with this. When we talk of Ethiopia, for example, also, ever since the start of the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, Ethiopia has been able to grow its own wheat and replace the wheat it was importing from Ukraine, to the point that Ethiopia became self-sufficient. The other country that we can speak of, even which was mentioned during the Russia-Africa summit that happened in St. Petersburg, President Putin said that he would give grain to countries, particular countries, including Somalia and Burkina Faso and Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe came out even to say at the Russia-Africa summit that it is self-sufficient. It does not need the grain. So if the grain is not coming to Africa, then where is this grain going to? If the grain, the Europeans, the United States, and the United Nations have been saying that is coming to Africa, is not coming to Africa, then where is that grain going to? Let us listen and hear from President Putin and see what he is saying as regards to the issue of grain and Russia's contribution to this issue. Now, what is President Putin saying?
Because the share of Ukraine in world grain exports, as it was 5%, remains so. And in the current conditions it will decrease, to put it mildly. The West deceived us about the humanitarian goals of the Black Sea Initiative to assist developing countries. Since more than 70% of the 32 million tons of cargo exported from Ukraine, I want to emphasize this again. More than 70% went to wealthy countries, primarily to the countries of the European Union, but
so President Putin says that the grain, majority of it is going to European countries. 70% of the grain that is coming from Ukraine is been going to the global north countries, and that includes the countries of Europe and of course Turkey itself. And President Putin mentions that only 3% of the grain is coming to Africa. Now, after President Putin had spoken during this particular visit by President Erdogan of Turkey, President Erdogan came to the microphone to speak for his part during this particular press conference. And President Erdogan said that 46% of the grain is going to Europe, and 14% of the grain is going to Turkey, and 6% is going to Africa. But if you were to consider Turkey being a NATO member as European, then that would still put the share of grain of Europe to 70%. And if we were still to take Turkey's words, Africa would be getting 6% share of the grain that is supposedly coming to benefit the poor countries. Now, this is a huge disparity between the facts that are being put out there for the world to feed on, especially by the United Nations, by the United States, by Europe, and Turkey itself. Now, without a shame, President Erdogan also has used this narrative to feed his country, which needs the grain that is coming from Ukraine, to continue to claim that the grain was coming to Africa. Of course, this is very unfortunate. It is very unfortunate. And I think that African leaders have a responsibility to come out and correct this narrative, have a responsibility of working together to correct this narrative, particularly this false narrative that is being pumped out by the West and the United Nations, that Africa needs to depend on Ukraine's grain. Let us look at the share of grain on the international market by Ukraine. How much grain is Ukraine producing when it comes to the international market? Because what we want to understand, does Ukraine really possess the capacity to feed the African continent? Does Ukraine possess the capacity to produce enough grain amidst an ongoing war, a war which is going on right now? Does Ukraine still possess the capacity to produce enough amidst a war to feed the African continent? Now, this is a question that we are trying to answer. This is a question that we are trying to answer. Now, when we look at data, from worldgrain.com, the 5 biggest producer of grain, Ukraine is not part of them. The biggest producer of grain in the world is China, with 2.4 billion tons of grain. That is number one, as you are seeing on the screen. Number two, the second biggest producer of grain, with 1.8 billion tons annually, is India. Still, that is not Ukraine. The third biggest producer of grain is Russia. Russia is the third biggest producer of grain, and this is still not Ukraine. The United States is the fourth biggest producer of grain, with 1.2 billion tons. Of course, Russia is producing also 1.2 billion tons. Now, France, with 767 million tons, is the fifth biggest producer of grain. We are not seeing Ukraine anywhere close here. The sixth biggest producer of grain on the international market is Canada, with 571 million tons. And this data came out in 2020. The data is for 2020 to 2023. The seventh biggest producer of grain is Germany with 491 million tons of grain. So still, we don't see Ukraine anywhere closer to those who are producing the most grain on the international market. Now, let us look at Pakistan. Pakistan is the 8th biggest producer of grain, even more than Ukraine, which has been hyped up by the propaganda from the Western media. Pakistan is the 8th biggest producer of grain. Ukraine is not among the 8 biggest producer of grain. So this is hype. What has been going on that Ukraine is producing grain to feed Africa and the global south. And therefore, if there's this war, which was started by Russia, supposedly the other countries will starve because of the absence of Ukraine's food. It is a false narrative. And as we have seen also, Africa does not depend on Ukraine's food to survive. And this narrative is false. Instead, it is Europe which is depending on Ukraine's grain the most. It is not Africa. Now let us go to number 9. Even number 9, the biggest producer of grain in position number 9 on the global stage is Australia with 456 million tons. It is still not Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is all the way in number 10, position number 10, with 433 million tons of grain. That is how much it is producing on the international market. This is its share. It is in number 10. As we have seen, number 9, 8, 7, 6, France with number 5, the United States number 4, and the biggest producers are China, India, Russia, the United States. At least the first 5 biggest producers, Ukraine doesn't exist there. Now, this should make us understand that the Western media is peddling a false narrative that the grain from Ukraine is very important, and therefore we should make noise about it. Maybe it could be because the Western world is suffering, that it is tired of supporting Ukraine when it comes to the issue of finance, and therefore they think that Ukraine should sell its own grain and get its own money to support its military activities, to support the war. So I think that they should admit it. If Europe is suffering because it does not have access to Ukraine's grain, then these two should be mentioned in broad daylight instead of using Africa and claiming that Africa needs the grain from Ukraine, because this is false. And this is also a responsibility of the Africans to find out this information and share it with each other. It is the responsibility also of the African leaders to put the records straight and mention it that Africa is not depending on Ukraine's food. And therefore, Africa can feed itself. As we have seen, majority of the countries which have been mentioned that they are getting Ukraine's grain, countries like Ethiopia, countries like Zimbabwe, countries like Uganda, even when they reached out to them that they want to convince them and give them grain, they mentioned that they are self-sufficient. Zimbabwe, even when they asked it to be given, they wanted to give Zimbabwe free grain from Russia. Zimbabwe said, we are self-sufficient. We have enough food. Uganda, when Ukraine reached out to Uganda to ask that they should give them grain, Uganda said, we are self-sufficient. We don't need food. Ethiopia, in a few years, in a period of 2 years, Ethiopia was able to farm its own wheat, its own grain, and in a period of 2 years, it was able to be self-sufficient and substitute all the grain that it was importing from Ukraine. So this false narrative that has been going on across the world and convincing people and lying to people that Africa needs the grain from Ukraine is a false narrative that should be debunked. Thank you very much if you've been watching. My name is Kwame Gonza. Once again, I've been on here trying to debunk the rumors that have been, spreading across the world that Africa needs Ukraine's grain. Africa does not need Ukraine's grain. And it is high time that we remove this shame that is being put on Africa, and Africa being used to feed other civilizations at the expense of the African people, at the expense of the dignity of the African people. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you so much.